reflect as it relates to our children who are deaf or hard of hearing. And you may find that this brings up some thoughts for you over the course of the next hour. And that's not untypical. I think 3 out of 5 of us have experienced some kind of maltreatment ourselves, or we know someone who has. So just sit with those feelings. The goal of the presentation is not so much to dwell on the difficult information, but to dwell on what we can do about it. I love this picture. It's kind of the new zombie apocalypse, right? The people walking, looking at their phones, not being aware of their environment. But awareness of this topic changes everything. My husband's credit union even has to do a training with their folks to make sure they're not engaged on their phones as they walk in the building. The owner, the CEO, wants them to drive around the parking lot and pay attention to what's going on, who's there, who are the cars, what people are they seeing before they walk in. That's part of their robbery training. And we can do the same on this topic. If we're aware of the incidents of maltreatment for our kids who are deaf or hard of hearing, and for any child who has a special need, there's so much more that we can do once we are aware. I'm also reminded of my son, who's a driver's ed trainer now. He says, if you're not swearing while you're driving, you're not paying enough attention. And I think about that. I'm a very calm person driving. I don't let people upset me. But when I saw it from his point of view, if I'm paying more attention 12 seconds ahead, I can see that this or that driver is doing the wrong thing or tailgating, and it makes me more safe. So paying more attention adds to the safety of everybody. A lot of people think this session doesn't apply to their kids, to their families, to their patients, to their students, but it applies to everyone. I want to share a little bit behind our why that Hands and Voices got involved in this project. First of all, a teacher of the deaf who's a professor preparing other teachers to join the field of deaf education said this is one area in his career that he didn't focus on, and he knew it was an issue. He knew kids were more vulnerable, and he just had not really focused on it. So as he was ending his last 5-7 years as a professor, he came to us with this question. We think this is an issue, and what can we do about it? So as a small group of parents, we just began to journal about this topic. What did we know about keeping our kids safe? Who in our communities could we find to help us learn more about it? There was hardly any research going on at that point. That was 2008, and we've been kind of the voice banging the drum ever since then. I've got a few stories I could share with you briefly. We won't go into a big detail, but where information is linked here, you can look yourself if you're interested in these stories. There is an audiologist who grew up at late identified hard of hearing, who wrote an article for us sharing about how she experienced safety issues. She was walking with a friend along the road, and a car approached them, and a man spoke, and she couldn't quite hear him. Well, like a lot of our kids are taught to do, she leaned in closer to the car and saw that he was exposing himself. Now, thankfully, he didn't try to reach for her, or it could have had a much different outcome. But she realized that the very thing that she was taught to do to get closer was the thing that could have put her in danger. She went on to share that there was an article about her and her mother as she was growing up in her community that appeared in the newspaper. And it was a wonderful, inspiring story about how hard they had worked together and how well she was doing in school. Well, years later in high school, the law enforcement folks reached out to them, the family, and said, this article was found on the wall of a pedophile who had gone to prison, and he had scrolled across it, death. And that just highlights for us that our kids can be targeted by people who want to hurt children as a vulnerable population. And she will be sharing a little more of her story when she meets with us on our monthly teleconference call. And you're all welcome to join. That's Allison Cunningham, and we hope she'll be joining on our March call. There's a high school boy that the mom reached out to me who was just so lonely for human contact, and especially a girlfriend, that he ended up paying all of his accounts to this supposedly young woman that he met on social media. And she was promising to come to visit him at his school for the deaf. Well, probably wasn't even a young girl. It was probably like a 50-year-old man or a string of thieves collecting money from people who are vulnerable. And our kids can be socially isolated, and that makes them vulnerable. So she had reached out to me about that story. And we've got a family that came forward anonymously and shared their story about a neighbor boy that moved in next to them, they moved into the new neighborhood, and there was this nice neighbor boy who offered to babysit, and he was not an appropriate babysitter for their young daughter. And so sharing that story just brings to light some of the difficulties that our kids can face. This is a taboo conversation in many ways, but we want to break that taboo. You know, like I said, awareness is everything. One thing that has helped over time is the Kaiser insurance study that looked at adverse childhood experiences. That's what that word means, ACEs, on my slide there. And the Kaiser group was actually looking at weight loss. And so to find this information correlating was so interesting. But they found that in interviews of 17,000 insurance holders in California, that if those people had experienced any of these adverse child experiences listed in my chart there, so physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, a parent who was in jail, any of those categories, the more that a person had experienced those, the more likely it was that they experienced long-term chronic health conditions and risky behaviors. So isn't it interesting and motivating that we find that a child who might experience these adverse events might grow up to have more chronic disease like diabetes or heart disease or experience depression? There's a strong correlation here. We can't wrap our kids in bubble wrap. I wish we could, but the good news is there are some protective factors that we can encourage in both parents and in our kids. And there's some really practical strategies that we can learn to use. So in the orange section, I've got a list of the protective factors that families have that keep them safe from abuse and neglect. And the first one is the most important, that idea that parents know how to nurture, how to strongly attach to that baby. And attachment gets a bad rap sometimes when we talk about it like bonding. It isn't a parent's fault if they were not connected right away to the baby, if there was medical issues or adoption. But it's just so important that there's proactive ways to keep furthering that strong attachment. Attachment is the basis of all language, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the specific knowledge of child development so that our expectations are not too high. You know, we're not expecting a 2-year-old to act like a 10-year-old, or too low, that we're setting the bar too low. and not helping our child grow in independence as they get older. Those are both important. Social connections for parents, that the idea that you're here today, connecting with other families and learning more about child development, that's a piece of that that helps you have a stronger sense of resilience. The concrete support for families, those are things like the Medicaid buy-in if your family needs extra insurance help or coverage for medical needs. It could be food, it could be housing assistance, it could be any of that. And then in children, it's, if you look at each of these 6 things that I listed, you can flip it in your mind that, this is the strength, but if a child doesn't have that, that is a risk factor. So if a child knows what a healthy relationship looks like, if they've grown up with that, they're going to be a little bit more protected than if, say, for example, there's not as much care in the home, there's not connections in the neighborhood, that kind of thing. A child needs to know that they have the right to say no. And if there happens to be any professionals in the group, you can model this. If you're an audiologist, you can say, may I have permission to take your hearing aid out and do some adjustments, or ask the child to hand it to you. That's modeling consent and the right to say no and the right to have your own body in your own control. The more adult connections that a child has as they grow, the better. We want them to have other people they can reach out to besides us as parents. In a school building, I hope that there's several teachers or a para or an interpreter or whoever, several people that a child feels safe talking to. Can they effectively communicate their day-to-day activities? Can they label their feelings from a very young age? There's a lot more than mad, sad, and glad. There's surprise, there's worry, there's all kinds of things. And mental state words are very important, we're finding. So even from those earliest days, parents can be encouraged to, narrate their day, but to talk about thinking words. Like I decided, I thought, dream, wish, opinion. Those are words that our kids need more and more exposure to really learn the concepts, whether you're signing, speaking, cueing, or both, or all 3. They need to understand the names of their body parts to be able to explain where they're hurting or where they feel uncomfortable. The concept of secret and surprises, to be able to know the difference. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And story retell is not just a communication and language issue. It's so important for a child to be able to retell something that they're worried about. So you have a sense of the beginning, the middle, the end of the story. And did it happen today? Was it yesterday? Was it a long time ago? Those are things that our kids really can struggle with. Understanding their emerging sexuality, that starts way earlier than a lot of parents believe. So it's important to keep on top of that. And understanding their own intuition, that uh-oh feeling when something just doesn't feel right, and being able to keep paying attention to that and build on it so that they begin to understand risky situations. So those are just the kind of the overview of protective factors, and we'll go into a little bit more on strategies. Parents already talk quite a bit and promote safety in so many ways. So we've got car seats. We teach our kids to swim. We talk about electricity and not putting our hands in the electrical outlets. As kids get older, we have rules about driving. We have rules about cell phones, and therefore a child's safety. On this middle picture is a child who, to most people, uneducated folks looking at that picture, she's just reaching up to touch her hat, maybe. Well, to the parents, that was her sign that she's about to rip out those hearing aids and hurl them. So knowing our child's nonverbal cues is really important. She didn't get any benefit out of hearing aids, and this was a picture just a couple days before they had a cochlear implant surgery. So knowing that child's cues and your child's individual cues is so important. But do we teach about people safety? There's things that you can learn as you grow, and that looking back now, I wish I had learned long ago about dealing with other humans. Think about how difficult it can be to just raise a difficult topic. I think those of us who are in partnerships can think right away of a difficult thing we need to talk to our partner about, because that's like happening all the time. And that needs to happen for kids. When we ask them to be good self-advocates, I think about that. Oh my gosh, we're asking a 6-year-old to bring up to an adult that they don't have good access in the classroom, and whatever their words are about using that, to be able to say, can I move so I can see better? Can I get closer to you so I can hear better? Or I can't watch this without captions as an older child. Those are things that are kind of the roots of people safety. And feel free to put in the chat if there's something you wish you had learned a long time ago. Some of this is about teaching our kids body autonomy, that their body belongs to them. Touch is a choice. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But setting boundaries with people we know and with people we don't know is part of teaching people safety skills. I mentioned already that I thought attachment was the most important protective factor. I just last week heard again a pediatric psychologist talk about how important attachment was. So I just love that presentation. If you ever get a chance to hear Dr. Debbie Mood, she's just wonderful on this. Our younger parents are still growing their frontal lobes. That doesn't finish till about age 25, 28. So if you're involved in early intervention, or if you're a young parent yourself, take encouragement that this part of your system is still developing, and having a young baby and toddler can help increase that ability to attach, even as you're going through it yourself. It's so interesting. But that back and forth, the visual attention, the touching, the rocking, it all builds the brain system to set the stage for language in physiology. Research has shown that the rhythm of, what's called mother ease, when we use that higher voice, even dads do the same thing, and kind of do that sing-song voice with our child, whether or not they are hearing it, they're feeling the rhythm, they're feeling your facial muscles, they're getting a sense of the breath patterns. And that is the beginning of language. And then when we start noticing that they're reacting, they smile, they light up. So we do the thing that got them to light up more, or they start to make a sad face and they move away, or they look worried. Then we stop doing that thing that worried them, or we at least try to reassure them. That's the beginning of serve and return and the building of language. And so interesting too that our babies respond. their neurological system responds like a mirror to us. So if we are calm and steady, it can actually help settle their nervous system. Just a good thing to remember if you're up at 2 a.m. with a child that can't seem to settle. If you can kind of maintain that emotional steadiness, it can make a difference. I'm at the end of our chat, I'll put in the link where you can learn a little bit more about this. There's a whole pediatric supplement. So if I forget, remind me. What are some other things that parents can do? So you're spending so much time with your child, more than they are at school. You're learning about their daily routines and how they respond, eating and playing and exploring and changing diapers and sleeping and going down for naps and getting up. You know what their cues are. So you can pay attention to if there are any changes. If there's changes in their behavior, this may be a sign of something you need to look into more specifically. Unfortunately, what we know, maltreatment is predominantly carried out by adults or older children who have gained the trust of a child's parent. We know also it can be a parent themselves, and that's just a reality. But I think even then, if we could get to those parents who are at risk of abusing their own child with this kind of information, we could help arrest that cycle. And our kids with any kind of difference, especially communication, are at the highest risk of maltreatment, 3 to 4 times greater risk than other kids. When are they most at risk? It's the youngest ages. So that's why we want to get this information to the families of the youngest kids. 90% of any victim is abused by someone they know and trust. That's also, in a very strange way, the good news, because we can do something about the people that we know. It's stranger abductions. While they do happen, they are extremely rare. This, who you control in your circle is something you can control. And so I want people to think about the person in the child's home who has access to them, a stepmother, a boyfriend, an uncle, someone that's just crashing at the house. Unfortunately, those are the folks who don't have a biological strong tie to that child, who can be a person at risk. So we just want to be very careful about who we let into that circle. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on any step parents. I have one myself. She is wonderful, but it's just a statistic reality that we need to be careful about that. Like I said, younger kids are most at risk, so we've got to choose our caregivers wisely. We're going to ask questions to interview them. Even a teenage babysitter, you want to ask a few questions, kind of get a reference, if you will. And maybe you don't trust a teenager with your child. Sometimes parents have to do things because there's no one else available, but we always have some choices. So think about, maybe that teenager's parent could also be available during the babysitting, just as an extra person to call or to check in. Babysitting is something you learn to do as well. So maybe you start with a very small half-hour trip to the grocery store and see how that goes, kind of thing. As kids grow, you're going to teach them some simple safety rules. So we'll think about that too. But observe, check in often, notice any changes in how your child looks, responds, or reacts. And that goes for kids who are not verbal as well. So our kids who are deaf, hard of hearing plus, we have to pay even more attention to their behavior. This Kid Power Protection promise at the bottom of the slide is something I think parents should consider doing, giving. with their children as they grow, just periodically 3-4 times a week saying or paraphrasing this kind of statement to them. You are very important to me. If you have a safety problem, I want to know. Even if I seem too busy, even if someone we care about will be upset, even if it is embarrassing, even if you promise not to tell, and even if you made a mistake or thought you made a mistake, please tell me and I'll do everything in my power to help you. I think that puts in a nutshell the importance of parents checking in and keeping a good communication going with their child. You can think about even things that happened to you as a child that you might have wished you'd had that open door to be able to ask more questions about. And when I have shared this with my kids, I didn't hardly ever get a safety issue that came up, but they brought up things that just worried them or things they were curious about, and it made for an open door. That parent safety toolkit is something we have on our website. It's free to download. It goes over a lot of this information in just the written form and gives you links for more, where to find more. So it's a good resource that anybody could use, parents, professionals, something to share with others. Along with prevention, want to be knowing the specific red flags to watch for in case of abuse or neglect. So we talked a little bit about any behavioral changes. If your child suddenly does not want to go to school or to childcare, just seems afraid or just reluctant, pretending to be sick, and that goes for going to anyone's house. It doesn't matter the circumstances. If they themselves seem to be acting differently, kind of cruel to others or regressing, like they stopped thumb sucking a long time ago, but now they are again, it's just something to think about, to explore. There's, of course, physical indicators, any kind of bruising, anything you could imagine there to look for, emotional signs to look for. See this picture of the dad talking to the daughter, just maintaining that connection and that ability to observe is so important. We want our children to talk to themselves as though they were their own friend. Not like some of us adults have learned to talk to ourselves and we have to stop saying, I'm disorganized, I'm late, I'm not getting all these things done. We need to encourage ourselves as a model to our kids. There's a couple other strategies we could talk to here. We talked about the daily check-in. How when you walk in the room and your dog is so happy to see you, that's how I hope parents act when we see our kids come in. Not immediately, why didn't you clean up the kitchen when you made your snack, for an older child, but just, I'm so glad to see you. How was your day? Let's ignore what's not done for a minute and just take a moment to connect. Connect before correcting. Value that attachment. Book reading is a great way to talk about a character and to label emotions as you're reading the book. There's an example here, Alex and the Scary Things. It never talks about what the scary thing is. So it could be anything, but it talks about how this little alligator deals with being scared. There's lots of books we have on our website through something we call the Book Club, videos and books, and it tends to be done virtually. So another name why we call it the Book Club. So books are a great way to increase a child's language and be able to talk about a character. Sometimes is a little easier than talking about a news story or something that actually happened in the child's life. It puts it, at an arm's length, a safe distance. Some families make this a rule, and I think it's a good one, that we don't keep secrets as a family. It's okay to keep a surprise. So if there's a birthday coming up and we've gotten dad a present, we can keep that a surprise, but we will eventually tell, and the surprise will make someone happy. A secret is something that folks who want to hurt children actually test them and see if they will keep a little secret, and then they might raise the bar. That's an example of grooming, and that's a concept that people use to test out who is vulnerable among the children that I come into contact with and who's likely to keep a secret. So it might be as simple as, oh, I said a bad word. Let's not tell your parents. And they kind of see what happens from there, or giving a little treat. And I hope that kids will say, we don't keep secrets in my family. And if, an aunt innocently says, oh, let's keep this treat a secret between us, that's not a good thing. And parents can be advocate to teach their family members to say, let's use the word surprises and not secret. Some families have a safety alert word so that a child can more easily get your attention. Say you're busy making dinner, paying bills, doing a household chore, and they want to talk to you and they don't quite have the words. Well, if you ask a question about your safety or come up with whatever word your family chooses, then everybody knows to put down what you're doing and talk right there. And that's worked well for my family. They even made up a word for the apocalypse. So if I use the word Rumpelstiltskin, we all know where we're supposed to go and what we're supposed to do if the world's coming to an end. Go figure. So it can be a little fun too when you're having these serious conversations. Kids need to be taught about friendship. Just because someone smiles at you does not mean they're friendly. Even kids in the neighborhood may just want to come over because your kid has the best toys. And that's not really true friendship. So that's another good reason to read books about friendship. So you can talk about the characters in the book. What is a friend? What do they do together? And what makes a friendship? Our kids can be socially naive. There's all these pictures of expressions just to remind you, as if you didn't know already, how fun it can be to live with a toddler and all their range of emotions. But let's teach them the names for these emotions. And as we stop doing the things that make them cry, they learn to regulate their systems a little bit better. As we talked about a little bit, knowing the actual names of your body parts is an important self-advocacy strategy. To be able to tell the doctor or mom or dad or whoever the child care person is, or a teacher or a school nurse, what hurts or what's happened. They could be a lot more specific. I've had families say they themselves didn't know the words for all the body parts. So, and that does happen. But teaching a little girl that her vulva is a front bottom does not help with anyone being able to understand what it is she means. So using the words as you're changing clothes, as you're in the bathtub, that's just an easy way to have kids learn all the words from elbow to ankle to earlobe, and all of those things. And using those routines is just a great way to learn. And again, being more specific about feelings and those feeling words and the mental state words, thinking, wishing, worried, upset. It's just the more specific they can be, the better they can communicate. There are some rules about touch that kids can be taught as they're very young. And all of these rules that touch or affection should be safe, should be the choice of each person, should be allowed by the adult in charge, and should never be a secret, are just 4 simple things that kids can be taught from a very young age. And wouldn't it be wonderful if this was a rule for adults as well, that it should be the choice of each person, so that, you know, your date should not be inebriated and you expect that they can give consent. We hope that our kids look for enthusiastic consent in their future sexual partners, right? I mean, we don't want anyone taken advantage of. And allowed by the adult in charge, of course, is a child rule, but that might be something that might need to be a rule shared so that kids are not exploring. It's normal and typical for kids to explore, but is that allowed? You know, that's where you get into the discussion about what's private and what's public. Private is typically what's covered by a bathing suit. Public is something you would do in front of anybody who might come into the house. So there's ways to make these concepts more concrete for kids. The final and an important step is establishing that circle of trust. Who gets to be alone with your child, which really gives them some control over what happens and what your child experiences. What are the safety policies at school, at camp, at childcare, at church? Do your friends and neighbors have the same safety rules that you do? Who else is going to be there at a sleepover? That's okay to ask. We're allowed to ask those kinds of questions when it comes to our kids' safety. And when we check in with our kids on that return, you know, think about saying, were you a good girl in front of the other people? Is that the only question you want to ask? I want to get face to face with my child and really get more of a sense of how it went and what happened. For one, it's an amazing experience to see how another family lives and how they do things differently. When we had kids over, they were always amazed that we ate dinner together and that we sat at the table and it wasn't in front of the television. And that was just a value that we always tried to manage, and it wasn't easy, believe me. I wish we'd had some TV days, but that's not the case for kids, other kids, and that may be something that they come home and want to talk about, how things are done differently. Kid Power is an international group that teaches safety, people safety for kids and adults of all ages. And they have these recommendations when looking at childcare. Take the time to learn about them, ask your questions. And once you've decided, then make sure that it's possible to make unexpected visits. Raise your concerns right away about any potential problems. Notice changes in personnel or policies or location that might affect your child. Is there adequate supervision going on? Is there specific permission required for field trips or any kind of change in the routine? Do things look like they're age appropriate? Are there older kids hanging out perhaps inappropriately? And if you are leaving your child with an older teen, is there permission to be able to call you if they need help, or do they have someone else that they can call? I'm a big fan of the babysitting classes as well. As kids get older, we look at that same circle of security that works for a toddler, and it's just a little bit more advanced for an older kid. So they're going out from the secure base and exploring, and you're going to give them the tools to role play or to practice before you really turn them loose. So just for an example, say they're walking to school for the first time. Well, maybe the first time you walk with them, but you say, what are the things you would be watching as you walk to school by yourself? And just have a chat about it as people pass and walk by them, as they cross streets. Those are all things you could talk to them about. What things would you pay attention to? And then maybe the next time you are walking 15 feet behind and they are handling it, but you're there as a safety net. And then maybe the next time they walk themselves, but they text you when they get there, so you have an idea how long it should have taken and if they were there in the right amount of time and if that seemed reasonable. Have them teach back to you what kinds of things they should be concerned about as they try a new activity. Maybe parents have a written agreement for access to digital devices. Our kids with access to the internet, it's like giving them access to a sewer, honestly. Do we want our kids to be able to pull up things by accident, even that, you know, even pornography sites typically name something similar to what a common search is. So if you look up the White House, you may not get the site that you need to get. So it's not necessarily looking on purpose, but even just by accident. So maybe there's a parental agreement with the child about what can be done with these digital devices, phones, laptops, whether they're in your room or not, whether you have access to them all the time, or if there's a safe place they're put at night, if they're limited to certain hours of the day, if it's related to after homework, or those are just things that parents can take responsibility for thinking about. Driving is another one. Do you necessarily get to drive? It's a responsibility and it's a privilege and it's an earned thing. It doesn't necessarily happen. I don't drive when I'm really tired or if I've had a drink at book club. Those are decisions that you just have to make. So consider their development in all areas as they grow. And this is a good framework for role playing for greater independence. Another part of our safety training is knowing when and where to report if you see something, say something. Having a child who's deaf or hard of hearing or working in this field brings us into contact with lots of kids, our kids' friends, fellow students, fellow folks at the audiology clinic. If you're ever concerned about the safety of a child, this is a number you can call, 1-800-4-CHILD. It's confidential. They will talk to you about what you're seeing, ask you questions, help you kind of define if you should take action or not, and they'll tell you what to do in your area. So it's a national number, also a text. There's a text line that is getting some attention. They've had some training to work with deaf and hard of hearing kids and adults. So increasingly kind of deaf friendly. And that's that crisis text line there as well. I have used this myself when I've had concerns out in the community or when I've had a parent bring me like an IEP advocacy case and I'm reading through the notes and I'm seeing that there's been a huge change in behavior. And this actually helped us arrest a problem that was beginning to happen with a staff person at school. So don't be afraid of calling. That's what they're there for, and it's 24/7. I'll be wrapping up here shortly, but I don't want to miss what to do if you do get a child who tells you something has happened. Of course, you want to accept that that child's information is true. Very, very rarely does a child make up something that has happened. You want to model being as steady emotionally as you can, confirm that you care about that child, comfort them, assure the child it is never, ever, ever their fault, ask some open-ended questions, but it is not your job to investigate. That's where you call and report. And there are child advocacy centers all around the country where kids might be brought in if there's a need to interview them or investigate further. They know how to really observe these kinds of things in kids without traumatizing them further, and just reaffirm that you love and care for them and you will keep them safe. Unfortunately, statistically, a child has to speak up 7 times before an adult takes action. 7 times. So I hope, if nothing else, as a result of this presentation, that you listen the first time and take action. Let's not make them go through 7 times of getting their courage together and trying to get the attention of a busy adult. There is so much more we can talk about. There's safety goals that can be added to IEPs or the 504 plan type education that can support safety skill learning. The Council for Exceptional Children, which is one of the largest special ed associations in the world, has finally adopted a recent policy concerning the prevention and response to maltreatment. And we've got some IEP safety documents. We've got presentations about bullying and digital safety and all kinds of things, which we won't have time to talk about today. So we want to get to any questions. What can groups focus on? I think the understanding people's safety needs to be added to your child's life, knowing some of the risks and reducing those risk factors. Teaching parents about the circle of trust is so important. Teaching some of these strategies like secrets versus surprises is one of them. And what if the unthinkable happens? Knowing how to observe, how to understand, and how to report. And that's where the hour comes from in the hour project. Who's going to do what by when? That's what that WWDWBW stands for. What are you going to do differently as a result of this presentation? Just think about what you might do differently with your child, with their caregivers, with your team, with your students, with your program. You'll get this presentation, so you'll get these links. This is our monthly call that we do October through June, and some of the presentations that we have. Sometimes we just talk as a group across Hands and Voices chapters and other organizations like Delaware, and talk about what we're doing in our communities to help kids be more safe. And finally, to wrap up, abuse stops here because you're more aware of it. And we want to return the presentation to some level of joy. As difficult as this has been to listen to and to think about, we know that awareness makes it possible for kids to be safe. And a kid who does not feel safe can't learn. There are so many things to celebrate with our kids who are deaf or hard of hearing. And we want to focus on that joy and attachment. We've got a whole program that I think of as a sister program to the Hour Project, and that's Fostering Joy. There's a whole website on just ideas that parents and professionals can use to increase the joy in raising their child and enjoying that child. So I want to take a moment here to see if there are any questions. I will stop sharing for a minute, and I've got 2 more slides to end with.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. Great information. We really appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Sara or the group? You can feel free to unmute yourself, or again, you can direct message me, or you can put them into the chat. I was actually going to say, Sara, that when you were talking about how to respond to a child, and to model emotional steadiness, that has to be incredibly hard when maybe you aren't even expecting it. You notice something, but you aren't expecting it, and then all of a sudden you are hearing this from your child or student or whoever it is. I have to imagine that is incredibly hard to compose yourself in a way that doesn't let on that you are upset as well.
It is really hard. And what helped me settle that idea in my mind was talking to deaf and hard of hearing adults. They talked about how they would go home from school and tell their parents something, and some of them would just get so riled up, like, I'm going to go take care of that thing. And it made it so they didn't want to tell them anything because they knew their parents would overreact. Like, oh, I don't want that. I
Right.
want to be that safe place to land. And it also gives you time to think. If you're just listening, maybe asking a question here and there, kind of slowing your pace, it gives you time to think of the next thing.
Mhm.
Anybody who's raised teenagers knows you need that little moment to think, you wrecked the car? Are you safe? Are you
Right.
okay now?
Right. After you get that past
No,
that,
I'm gonna kill you. Yeah.
when you can jump into action. Yeah, but I was just thinking that, and just how difficult that must be, in that moment, because
Yes.
that's a pretty raw moment. Um, is anybody else? Anything else? And I will also put Sarah's information into the chat, and she mentioned that you'll get this presentation. I can email this to everybody who signed up. And if you do have any questions that you would feel better sending in private, you can always reach out to Sarah or send them to me and I can send it to Sarah. So feel free.
One thing I didn't mention is we have an exhibit that can be rented out. You know, it's free, of course, but we just mail the exhibit off to any organization. And it has some of the books we talked about in the book club, like Alex and the Scary Things. It's got a quilt. A couple years ago, some of our groups made a story quilt talking about some of these concepts. And it has some handouts that might be helpful to use. Say you would have a conference or a family event, just something to consider. And it would get you some hands-on there.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I'll turn it back to you. So you said you had a couple more slides.
I just had the one. So let me put in
Oh,
the supplement I talked about, the pediatrics supplement. I'm going to put that in the chat here. Whoops, it didn't copy. Hold on a sec. But I would be very interested to know if you've ever heard a presentation like this before, if there was anything that was new to you. That helps us as we talk to other groups. Didn't get that link again. Too many windows open. There it is. Oh, it's on my paper, but not on my. I'm gonna have to send it to you, I think.
okay, I will send it out to everyone. Not a problem. I'm also going to send to everybody just a couple more events that are coming up for anybody who is interested. And
Awesome. That parent connection is so important. And, this is something you might need some time to think about, but I hope that you guys will have a chance to converse about it again, because it might raise some light bulbs as you think about it further. And I'm an introvert. It takes me a while to process.
Yeah, it's a hard topic, but really important. And thank you again. We really appreciate taking that you took your time out to help us and inform us and be there for everybody. So thank you again very much.
Absolutely. The link didn't copy, but I did get the title of it. It's the Pediatrics Journal, and it was a whole series in this one supplement of articles that looked at pragmatic language, which is social language for kids who are deaf or hard of hearing, from tiny babyhood through adulthood, and things that parents and professionals can do to support that.
Perfect.
It's
Okay. Perfect.
such good information, not light reading, but good stuff.
Yes. Yes, I imagine. Well, thank you again. And yes, I will be sending everybody an email with a bunch of information. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to our interpreters, again to Sarah. We really appreciate everything.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.